Well, it's a pleasure to be with all of you folks this morning. Yes, Lutheran Advocacy-Minnesota is an organization that is a ministry of the ELCA and all 6 Minnesota synods, and we work on issues of hunger, poverty, and care of creation. Our Hunger Advocacy Fellow and is just a real blessing in the office. And you'll actually see the very first video that we do, Jake put together. So it's just very cool. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the translation for the Spanish part of that video, but you know, you'll just have to assume that you sort of are guessing what she's saying from the other people.
You want me to translate it?
Yes.
Yes,
please. At any rate, it's great to be here. It's great to be able to talk about COP28. If you're not familiar with what COP means, it's the Conference of Parties, and it's for the United Nations, the International Climate Conference that they have every year. And it's where the discussions are held about climate. Actually, there's probably like 5 to 9 meetings that happen in between COPs. But then the COP is the big place where they're trying to come to big agreements and so on. And so I had the privilege of being there in person last year. And then this year in Azerbaijan, I was a virtual delegate. And at the last second, we were able to get Jake in as a virtual delegate. So the two of us in our respective homes were up till ridiculous hours. Well, everything there was happening between like 10:30 our time PM and 10 AM our time. So that was an interesting couple weeks. So, all right. Faith and climate action.
We need change. We need climate justice for children. We need action as the children of the world.
Could you introduce yourself, who you are, where you are from, and what church you are with?
I'm Sophie from the Church of Sweden.
Andreas, and I'm from Norway and Church of Norway.
My name is Bishop Marika Markovics, and I'm Bishop of the Diocese Linköping in the Lutheran Church of Sweden.
Eu sou Karine Bentman, de Brasil, pela Igreja Evangélica Luterana, de Confissão Luterana do Brasil.
Karine from the Brazilian Lutheran Church.
At Church of Sweden, and I think my message is that, you know, we don't have time to pretend that this is not happening.
From the beginning to the end in the Bible, you can read about the stewardship we have for the whole planet.
And we have to change the way we as Christians think about stewardship. Stewardship is not a way of controlling nature and creation. It's a way of living in total knowledge of our total dependency of nature.
Nosotros precisamos de una fe y de una espiritualidad que esté en regresar de la tierra, que tenga vínculos con la tierra, que cuide de ella.
Faith that's grounded in, like she didn't say creation, but in the earth, where she talked about spirituality, a little bit of mystery.
I see my name also.
Oops, dropped my mouse, so sorry.
As the people living in Tuvalu suffering from floods.
Since this is the case, this is really a matter of life and death. I've heard so many people say, like, we're already in survival mode. To sit on your hind horse then and just look the other way, that's not an option. You need to actually listen to those people.
I think that's one of the things Jesus would have done if he lived now. And he would live the green life, and he would encourage people to do the same.
We as the children, therefore, call for action, because action speaks louder than words.
And you will probably lift tables of some oil companies
That's my favorite part right there. I can just imagine Jesus coming in, like, tossing the tables in the temple, but tossing the oil table lobbyist stuff aside or whatever. So yeah, that's, and thanks to Jake for making this lovely video. So as Christians, we read in the Bible that the whole earth is full of God's glory. And in the Psalms, it tells us that the heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims God's handiwork. Now, when you think of firmament, what do you think of? Since starting to work on climate change, it now, to me, is just like, well, that's the atmosphere, right? So if the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament is showing God's handiwork, it's showing how God created things to be in perfect, stable order. And we're the ones who've messed it up. So by having issues with the climate, by burning fossil fuels, we have messed with the firmament and with God's own handiwork. So COP28 was in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. It's a glitzy place. Not every place was glitzy. There was one place that I walked to between the metro and the hotel where I stayed, where the houses were like one-room houses or one-room apartments in a fourplex. And apparently, they were fixing them up so that people could live there again. But what they had been, and that people had been living in, was pretty awful. But a lot of the city looks like this. The amount of food that we got fed sometimes was just ridiculous. They have a very modern metro, a very modern look. They also have a real pollution problem. And we were feeling that the whole time that we were there. And the United Nations event was at the place where they had the World's Fair in 2020. Now 2020, of course, was the COVID year, so who knows if they even had very many people come. But that worked out well so that the United Nations could host, or actually Dubai hosted, but the United Nations could have everything set up just perfectly, and it was a big, huge place. A lot of walking. I think I walked probably 8 to 12 miles a day getting between things. And the place itself, so you can even see, wow, like that whole thing is the complex that we were in. Wow. So yes, a lot of walking. And one of our colleagues said, it's almost like an amusement park when you're walking through these things. They had fancy lights at night and sparkly things during the day and just all sorts of things that, apparently Dubai is really into some of that stuff. We also went one night to see some of their fountains, and it's all choreographed and, just fancy it seemed like. The faith situation in Dubai, there's a mosque about every, if you imagine Lutherans in Minnesota, or Lutheran churches in Minnesota, that would be like the mosques in Dubai. And then there's one area where the churches and the Hindu temple is. So when we were getting into a cab to go to the church for one of the first events, we were getting in, and we were trying to tell him, looking up like where we needed to go, and he's like, oh, you're going to a church? Okay. And he just took off. And it's like, but don't you need to know which church? No, it's good, I know. And so he went, and it was like 3 churches that serve various denominations. And so like one of the churches just has services almost all day on Sunday. And so we were in I believe it was an Anglican church, but they had Baptists who worshiped there at one point during the day, and they had others So it was definitely interesting to see that Dubai seemed to put everybody in one spot. It wasn't actually that easy to get to, not very accessible by public transportation. The first couple days of COP are generally the mucky mucks. You know, the people who are the leaders of different nations. The first, I think this was the second day that we were there, John Kerry was introducing what the United States plan was. My colleague from the Washington, D.C. ELCA office and I were two of about 25 people who were able to be there to hear him speak, and then to hear John Podesta speak, who was the U.S. negotiator, and to hear some of the other U.S. delegation that was there to be doing the negotiations. They drive these mucky mucks around in these nice little golf carts, and the reason I could get a picture so nice was because I was walking down, and all of a sudden there was this beep beep behind me, and I was like, there went John Kerry. So, at any rate, it felt a little weird to be in such proximity, but it was also a situation where the security that first week was insane. So, you know, you'd have to plan to go like 3 hours before the first thing that you wanted to go to, because it might take 2.5 hours to get through security, or even more, and then you still had to walk to where you were going to go once you got in the complex. So, tricky stuff. I am so sorry.
Oh, it's not.
Okay, we
We thought we had a glitch in the sound system.
Yeah. I mean, it just started all of a sudden.
Means it is everybody likes it.
You must have been listening to classical and
It was my phone?
Yeah, it's on my phone.
It's not our sound system.
And actually, let me, sorry, I wasn't even hearing that.
well, that's good.
That's why people were rushing around.
Yeah.
So let me just turn off anything else that might turn on. What day is it? It's Sunday, okay. Mark Sunday off. All right. And I set like, I mean, it's actually rather late, but yesterday was a Saturday, right? So, so I was sleeping late, and okay. That one's taken care of. So I set like 12 alarms because I'm a night person.
It was lovely background noise.
Well, good.
We were trying to get it off.
I was wondering what you all were running around, and I wasn't even clued in at all. So like there's 3 clock radio alarms that will go off, and
You're hard to wake up, huh?
I am hard to wake up. All right, all the alarms are taken care of. I'm so sorry about that. All right, so we were talking about the mucky mucks, right? And all of these leaders that came from all sorts of countries. Joe Biden did not go, although he had been planning to, in large part because this was happening in November, and the war between Israel and Palestine, or Israel and Gaza, started in October. And there was a lot happening right then, and he was trying to negotiate things and so on. Kamala Harris came for about a day. There was a congressional delegation, including people from both parties, who came for about a day, I think it was. And it was sad to see how little they actually participated in. They did some tours of Dubai. I don't know where all they went, but they didn't spend very much time at all in the complex where things were happening. They weren't meeting other leaders. They weren't meeting faith leaders. They weren't meeting other folks. They weren't hearing the stories of people from the global south. So that was really sad. They had an opportunity and they kind of lost it. After seeing John Kerry and getting beeped out of the way, I was walking along, and there's this whole crowd that's gathering, and people were standing on, like, what is it, the flower box things and so on, trying to look. And I saw this guy, I'm like, well, that guy looks like a military guy, but what kind of, deal is that? And then I noticed this guy, so Macron from France. Well, I had asked one of the security people, do you know what's going on? He's like, no, they don't tell us anything. So I was just standing there by a rope, and everybody else is trying to get super duper close to him. Well, I'm just standing there, and all of a sudden he's coming my way, and he walks right up to me, and he shakes my hand, and I didn't know what to say. So I was like, well, thank you for your work on climate change. And he just had the shocked look like, you're not talking in French. So anyways, but like I said, there were a lot of leaders that were there the first few days. And so, high-level stuff that was happening, not so much of the negotiations, but a lot of the statements, like this is what our country is working for, this is what we're trying to do. Part of what John Kerry had announced that day when we were like 2 of the 25 in that room was the work on methane and trying to reduce methane emissions. This is the man who was the presidency of the COP. So the country that hosts gets to appoint the presidency. In Egypt, which is a petro-state, they appointed somebody who was part of the petro businesses. In Dubai, this man is an engineer in the petroleum business. In Azerbaijan this year, they appointed somebody else with a petro background. So, some problematic things. But Dubai and this particular guy really wanted to have Dubai lifted up as, hey, we're doing stuff here. So he wanted it to be a historic COP event. And so, so he was really pushing for a few things to happen, even though word came out that he was trying to do some side things, trying to make some oil deals with countries. And it's like, okay, on the one hand, we're talking about, are we phasing out of fossil fuels? And on the other hand, you're trying to make deals to sell stuff to other countries? This is a bit of a dissonance. And the oil lobbyists were there in massive numbers. There were 2 buildings that I spent a lot of time in, because those were the buildings that had the development stuff, the food security folks, health, agriculture, those sorts of things. So those were the buildings that I spent a lot of the time in when I wasn't at the Faith Pavilion or trying to listen in on the actual negotiations. And there were 2,700 oil lobbyists at COP28.
Oh my gosh.
Now this year, the number of people who were at COP was basically cut in half or more, and there were still 1,700 oil lobbyists there. Yeah.
Out of how many participants?
Out of close to 10,000. So, yeah. Yeah, it is, yeah.
Tammy, so are they there to say, look, we do good things too? Or coming to that event, it seems like, I'm sorry, you're in the wrong pew,
Yeah.
What was their motivation?
A big part of it is to make sure that the decisions that are made are not going to harm their bottom line, their businesses.
Well, yeah.
And they do make a nice show of, hey, look what we're trying to do. And it comes down to what a lot of oil companies now are talking about is carbon capture and storage. But in some ways, it's a smokescreen. So, so they're talking about capturing carbon, and there's a program here, I was going to get to this at the very end, but in Minnesota, we just had the permitting go through for a pipeline that captures CO2 from ethanol plants in Minnesota, in South Dakota, in North Dakota, and takes it all to the Bakken oil fields and puts it in the ground, but it's used as enhanced oil recovery. I mean, so they're actually like using the carbon that they're putting into the ground to push more oil out. So on the one hand, they're talking about, hey, you know, here we are, we're pushing these great climate solutions, we're talking about carbon capture, and that's an important thing, and yeah, it is an important thing, but not when you're using it for the wrong purpose. And so, yeah, they play way too big a role. One of the problems is that they are governed by consensus. And so, if you look up on Google, the AI definition that comes up is that consensus decision-making is a process where a group works together to reach a decision that everyone can broadly accept. But what it really means is that if 189 countries agree on something and Saudi Arabia says no, it's not going to happen. And that's what was happening in Dubai. That's definitely what was. Saudi Arabia was the country that was in the way a lot. When it came to deciding where COP29 was going to be, remember what I said about Azerbaijan and it being another petrol company or country? It was first proposed, it was supposed to be in like Eastern Europe. So it was proposed for Poland. Russia said no, not Poland. Some of the, like Estonia, and I don't remember what all else they suggested. Russia vetoed everything until finally Azerbaijan was lifted up. And then they said, sure, we'll do Azerbaijan. So that governing by consensus, in some ways, ends up being governing by the person or the country that is trying to undermine the most. And that's frustrating and hard.
You think they'll change that?
There's been a lot of talk about that. The challenge is that to change it, they have to get a consensus. So that's challenging. Yeah. So this year, COP29 was in Baku, Azerbaijan. The ELCA asked if I wanted to go in person, but I was going to have to pay more out of my pocket. And we were hearing a lot about the security issues in Azerbaijan. And I asked if there was a virtual option this year, and they said yes. I said, can I be a virtual observer? Yes, so that's what I did. I was a virtual observer. And like I said earlier, we were able to get Jake in almost last minute, like the day before it was starting, to be another virtual observer. And I found out later that the reason that the ELCA decided that Jake should have that opportunity is because of what our Senate and House did in 2023 to move legislation along related to energy issues. 100% clean energy by 2040, things like that. There was a whole list of things, and John could probably list them all off, but but that helped to allow Jake to be a part of it, and then one other hunger advocacy fellow from California, another state that's doing more, was also able to participate. And we had a couple of folks from the work with Native communities who were also part of it. Last year with COP28, our virtual delegates were someone from Lutheran Disaster Relief, from World Hunger, and someone from the California office she's actually a meteorologist. She's not with us anymore, but she'd started as a hunger advocacy fellow, but talk about somebody who knows what she's talking about. She knew what she was talking about. In Baku, what I understand is it was really hard for the folks who were there. They talked about how the State Department gave them a briefing before they went about security issues, about, like immediately everything was moved to WhatsApp. And then once in country, the whole ecumenical delegation from Europe and Africa and whatnot said, no, we're moving to Signal because it's more secure. And what they said was, don't take any pictures in any place other than the complex where we are. Don't do anything that might be suspicious because you are being watched. And not just watched, the security situation was pretty dangerous too. One of our Episcopal colleagues on her way to the airport was driven off into the middle of nowhere by the cab driver, and she was robbed of everything she had and left there. And I don't know how she got back because they took her phone, but somehow she got back to the main United Nations area, and people got her what she needed to be able to come home. They took her passport too. So some scary stuff. And my colleague Regina, who's been at COP now for 4 years or 5, she doesn't just represent the ELCA, but she's been representing an organization in California and an organization in Texas, and so, with 3 different organizations helping to pay her way and whatnot, she's been able to go several years. But she said it was a dank and dark place, it was cold there, and she said you can tell that it used to be part of the Soviet Union. So, a big part of what was happening in COP 28 was the global stock take. And when you hear that, what does that sound like? Taking stock, right? How are we doing? What's the report card? In Egypt, prior to that, and in a couple of years before even, people said, well, we think we're really off track with these Paris goals. We need to get better on track. And then people would say, well, we've got the stock take coming up, so let's not worry about it yet. We'll see how we're doing. We might not be doing nearly as bad as we think we are. We're probably doing a lot better. So let's wait till the stock take. Well, the stock take showed some pretty bad stuff. And in fact, I came away from a couple meetings at one point like, man, we're on the path to, between 2.6 and 3.0 Celsius increase in temperature. And if you think of the rising temperature like a fever, so what does a high temperature do to your body? So the Earth has a fever right now, and yeah. Part of the stock take was looking at a few different areas. Now at COP 28, the Loss and Damage Fund was passed on the first day in the first hour, and everybody was like, oh, look what we did, look what we did. But it had almost got there the year before, and it had been in the works for a while. So all the way back to 2007. So it took a while to get there. But they did. They got to loss and damage. The other areas that we tend to talk about are mitigation. So mitigation is what you need to do to stop the climate warming and to pull whatever's needed out of the atmosphere to help us maybe move back. So far we're not really doing any of that. Adaptation is helping people figure out and communities figure out how they're going to manage in the midst of a changing world. So as I look at like bonding in Minnesota and I'm looking at storm sewer things, I'm like, yep, that's adaptation, that's climate resilience, because previous storm systems can't manage anymore. But in the case of a lot of countries, it's related to severe flooding and loss of crops, loss of agriculture, severe disasters, how do you adapt in that kind of a situation? There's one pastor who was there. He's the president of the Pacific Council of Churches, Pastor James Bhagwan. And Pastor James said at one point, we've had 3 typhoons within just a couple months. People have lost everything. They've lost their homes, they've lost their livelihoods, they've lost their possessions. In many cases, they've lost family members. He said, I'm the pastor, so I should be pastoring them, right? But I've lost things and people too. So how do I pastor people when I am also suffering? And at one point, he kind of suggested, like, well, if North Americans are looking for something to do, here's an opportunity. And I think it was less that North Americans could help them in their trauma and more that they could share their trauma with North Americans so that North Americans would get it. And at one point he actually said, you, pointing at those of us who were from the United States, you are literally killing us. And he told us we needed to repent. I've been thinking a lot about that. What does that mean? And how do I communicate that with churches across Minnesota, including churches, unfortunately, where there's still a lot of climate denial. So that's the challenge. Anyway, loss and damage, yes, that was in the works for a long time. What we see with loss and damage is there are economic impacts of climate change. So, income is impacted, whether it's agricultural production, business operations, tourism. There's physical assets that are impacted, infrastructure and property. There's non-economic, so indigenous knowledge that may be lost, or society and cultural identity. That's one of the things that Pastor James Bhagwan said. At one point he said, are you going to let us live in your houses when ours are completely underwater? Can we come live with you? And then he said, but we don't want to because how would we be able to continue our cultural practices and things that are important to us and the sharing of the community that's important to us. So there's just a lot that can be lost there. For individuals, the loss of life, health, human mobility, the environment, biodiversity, ecosystems, etc. And then you've got the extreme weather events. So droughts, heat waves, tropical cyclones, floods, storm surges. And then, what's that?
Fires.
Yeah, and fires, exactly. And so then we've got, related to it, the sea level rise, the increasing temperatures, land and forest degradation, desertification, glacial retreats, and related impacts. In fact, there have been studies that show that with the melting of glaciers, volcanoes are becoming more active because the glaciers, when you had heavy glaciers on the volcanoes, it was able to suppress that activity. And as those are melting, for instance, in Iceland, they're getting more activity. Now, Iceland has always been a country with a lot of volcanoes, but they're starting to think about what does this mean. And I just read this week sometime about someplace in Alaska that's having some issues with this too. So, loss of biodiversity, the ocean acidification, so many things. And what's happening with the loss and damage then is that they're trying to come up with the money, and when that passed, first United Arab Emirates said, well, we're going to put $100 million towards this. And then Germany said, we're going to put $100 million towards this. And folks were saying, come on, push the United States, push your representatives there. The United States put forth $17.5 million, but, and here's the key word, it was not subject to congressional approval. Now, they got ragged on a lot by other countries, by all of our ecumenical partners. Like, what are you guys doing? You have to work harder on your delegation. Well, later in the week, $400 million was promised or committed, subject to congressional approval for adaptation issues, and that's never going to happen. Not with the Congress that we have currently. So for me, I was like, at least the 17.5 was something that was real. The rest of it was not real. But a lot of countries do not understand how our system works. And this year, that was a huge problem, because this COP29 happened right after the US elections. So there was just a lot of concern about what was going on, and Argentina pulled their delegation about an hour after their president talked to Donald Trump. So they brought their delegation home. There were other countries that didn't send their top negotiators. There was a ton of distrust. The Africa group started out saying, you know, when we're working on this, because I was watching the negotiations on adaptation, and they started out saying, you know, we want to do this, we want to write this as a group so that we can see what's happening and we can make sure that this is what's going to happen. And other countries were saying, no, you know, just let the co-chairs write this up and then we'll talk about it. And what I was envisioning was sort of like a legislative markup, you know, but worse, because instead of a legislative markup, it was people from wealthy countries who were writing it. And the Africa group felt like there were many, many things that got left out right from the start, and to get those things added was a real challenge. And so they said, you know, we should have been working on this together right from the start so that you'd be hearing our concerns. And that's one of the challenges that, you know, this process has. Adaptation, underfinanced, underprepared. This impacts a number of different things. I mentioned health issues, food security, you know, finding ways to adapt in all of these different areas. Skip that. The funding for adaptation needs to be this. Where is it? It's right here. And the goal in for COP28 was to double the adaptation funding. And not adaptation funding from this amount, but adaptation funding from 2019, which was less. So if you start with a small amount and you double it, it's still a pretty small amount. And they did not make that goal, and they did not make it this year. In fact, this year, I don't believe there were any commitments really made for adaptation. So that's one of the things that our southern partners are really, really concerned about. Mitigation. Do you see sort of the climate spiral here? Broken records was the way that the United Nations framed it. You know, that it just keeps getting worse and worse. Now this is a chart that I found interesting, and I think we've already gone beyond. This is supposedly for the modeling. At 1.5, things like hot temperature extremes will occur 4.1 times more frequently. And so if it's a 10-year event, well then maybe it happens, you know, a bit more frequently. If it's a 50-year event, you know, some of those really record temperatures, they're likely to occur 8.6 times more. Heavy precipitation, so where you're getting, instead of a regular rainfall, you're getting what we had here in 2013, 8 inches in 2 hours that flooded my basement, and I had to redo my entire basement. And that wasn't even much compared to what other places are getting. So places are getting 24 inches, 30 inches of rain at a shot. So that's happening more frequently. Agricultural and ecological droughts, the frequency 2 times more. So, but when you actually look at how often these are happening, it feels to me like it's happening even more than was predicted in these models. And in fact, although they were saying, 1.5, we've gone past 1.5 now. We've passed it. We're on the way beyond 2.0 in many ways. If we don't change things immediately, we're going to blow past 2.0 Celsius. Now, I don't say that to make you despondent and decide, all is lost, I'm not going to do anything. But really to say this should motivate us. And more than anything, this should motivate us to motivate other people. Yeah.
Tammy, the overwhelming feeling I get is powerlessness. Just, you've got the individuals who are in charge of oil, which runs everything, all that money, and then we sit here throwing our tens or whatever into a plate and hoping that we can make a difference. What is your answer to that? I mean, I don't want to steal your thunder if that's where you're going.
It is where I'm going.
Okay, I'll hold off then.
But, actually, you know what? Why don't we go there? Well, faith, role, and influence. Let me just share with you a few ways that we as part of the faith community could make a difference, and then I'll get into, where should we look for hope. So, the very first day, there was a Talanoa dialogue, and we had, this actually isn't very many people, there's a whole audience. This is just the panel. There's a whole audience in the church as well. We divided up into groups for adaptation, mitigation, and just transition. And the just transition and mitigation groups were really large. And I went to adaptation, and that's this group. But what we did was we addressed some things, like where are we? What needs to happen? Where should churches and communities of faith be engaged? And what can we offer to these processes, at the level of the United Nations? And actually our input then was given to people at the United Nations. So initially that felt empowering, and then I started wondering, well, I wonder what they do with that. Where do they share that? Last year, for the first time, there was a faith pavilion, and that offered a place where people of faith could meet, we could run into each other, whereas otherwise, amongst 10,000 people, sometimes it's difficult. Although it was interesting, because I kept running into the same people over and over, and there were people who I was looking for, and I could not find them. So, some of these panels actually were such that I knew that they were being recorded, and I wanted to get a hold of the recording because I thought if we could share that with every Lutheran church, along with some study questions, people would not be able to say in the same way, oh, this isn't happening, oh, this is a hoax, oh, this, isn't important, because they'd be hearing from our brothers and sisters from Africa and from Fiji and from other places. Unfortunately, the video qualities were so poor that you can't. We had a faith stock take as well. And so part of that was, what is missing in climate discussion and action? What are faith communities doing or not doing that needs to be changed or needs to be improved? And what should be the role of faith communities in global conversations, discussions, and negotiations? In other words, places like COP. And so we had basically about 2 hours with people from all over the world sharing their thoughts and their ideas. And it was very interesting. It was also a little frustrating in that some people kept saying, well, there are some people who are just lost, let's just, write them off, because they're never going to come along. And so that's what I was addressing when I spoke, and I said, we can't just say, well, because, they're at this point right now. And I talked about some ways that I've had conversations with some folks in our Minnesota Senate. Now, nothing has worked with one particular guy, but there's another guy whose opposition is softer than it used to be. And so, things can happen, things can change. And I believe in miracles too. And I believe that we all should. And after I spoke, then Pastor James from Fiji and Bishop Murray from Panama all jumped in and said, yes, and not only should we be talking about this way in our churches, we should be meeting with business people, and we should be talking with these people, and we should be doing this, because people listen to faith leaders. And as faith leaders, we are at the front lines. We know what is happening in our communities, and people can better listen to us. At any rate, it was fun and interesting. Here's a video.
Is representing the Lutheran Advocacy-Minnesota, and I'm one of the member champions. Then from our federation coming from Kenya, local southern country in Africa. As a youth activist, presenting the voices of millions and millions of youth who are being brought under the platform of faith-based organizations, we would want to see action. There is nowhere where the parties and negotiators have decided on how to phase out fossil fuels. The young people at the global level, at the local level, at the regional level, are the worst hit. But guess what? We are the first respondents. When people are displaced, they run to the church. We share with them our homes. Okay. You know what happens? We have stood as a shield, raising one another. So what we need now is this party and this delegation and this year and this scope to act on what's best. We have to change the narrative. It's not just going to be about the economic losses, but rather the non-economic losses. How will you compensate a society that has lost hope? A society that time in, year out, has to face the wrath of floods. Like in my country, Kenya, what my family is specifically going through right now, we are displaced. It's all over the news. You can go read River Tana. What do we have to say about Madagascar? What do we have to say about the threats that are facing the islands? What do we have to say about countries that have had to deal with extreme wildfires? Let's be agent of hope. Thank you so much.
Interesting, he's part of the youth delegation, but it's important to note that youth in the rest of the world would basically be young adults or beyond in the United States. So in Africa, you're considered a youth until you're about 35. So if I recall, I think he has a PhD and is the director of a nonprofit organization. But he spoke very eloquently last year, he spoke very eloquently this year, and it's those 20 to 30 somethings that are really standing up and speaking up, and they are calling upon church leaders from other generations to do a lot more. And I think that's an important piece. Okay, this is Pastor James Bhagwan. I have various pictures of him, and none of them turned out very well. And I have some videos of him, and those didn't turn out very well either. But that's not a video, no. But Pastor James, he's the guy who said, who's going to pastor us? And he has actually, so part of adaptation, he has actually formed trauma teams. So community people, community volunteers from the churches, from faith communities who are trauma volunteers who in many cases have experienced climate trauma themselves, and they go and work with communities that have just been hit with climate trauma and work with them. And so when he was kind of suggesting that maybe North American pastors should come, I think he'd really like them to see some of what they are doing. We talked earlier about that pipeline. That actually came up. So some of the ecumenical group was able to get into some of the negotiations. That was really hard in person last year. In fact, Christine, who's the ELCA person in DC, and I, at one point, we tried to get into a meeting room, and there were like more than 100 open chairs. And so you've got the delegates who are talking, and then there's all of these other chairs. Well, these are for the overflow, the delegate overflow. So staff of delegates, wives of delegates who weren't sitting in on any of the sessions, but who were going to the beach, husbands of delegates who were not there either. So there were a lot of people who sort of came along for the trip as part of their country's overflow, and yet like 100 seats were designated for the overflow. And then there were 7 seats that were designated for observers. So we waited for about 45 minutes before some other people got sick of watching and left, and then we were able to get in and take a couple of those 7 seats. That's one of the things that's a lot easier when you're online, is because you're watching, you can hear everything. There's not a limit to the number of people that can be in a room because you're there online. So this year, instead of going to a number of panels and interacting with a number of faith leaders, I was a lot more engaged in the observing online. And then meeting with the ecumenical folks who were working on adaptation issues to say, you know, this is what I was hearing in this meeting, and you know, this is what I was hearing in this meeting. Oh, in this draft, this is the way it's coming out. These are things that we're concerned about. Can you talk to the US delegation? Can you talk to the EU delegation? Can you talk to the Africa delegation? You know, so that, and every morning we met and every evening we met. So we were meeting close to 2 hours a day, just strategizing, talking, sharing information. But one of the things that came up was carbon capture and storage. And the guys who were hearing about it said, I don't know anything about carbon capture and storage. I've heard nothing. I don't know what this is. I don't know what this means in the document. And I was like, oh, 3 weeks ago, I had this training from CURE in Minnesota, and I couldn't believe that I became the expert on something like that, because 3 weeks earlier, I had not been an expert, but I ended up contacting a couple of colleagues here in Minnesota who sent me a ton more information. I was sharing that with folks from the ecumenical team and people who were observing virtually. And so we had about 4 or 5 of us who were writing up talking points for people to go to their delegations and say, this is problematic. You know, this enhanced oil recovery is part of why this is being pushed, and this should not be the case. So where are we now, and where is there hope? Now this is one more depressing thing, where are we now? So I've talked a little bit about some of the other depressing things, but the United States is basically in the same category as Russia in terms of how much we care or don't care about what's happening. Now it does say, you know, that's still like 70% of people say that our national government should be doing more to tackle climate change, but we do not have the right people in our U.S. House and our U.S. Senate to make those kinds of decisions. And the way that our system works with 2 senators from every state, regardless of population, that skews things towards rural areas, and the rural areas are tending to be more conservative, although some of the folks who've been really impacted in agriculture are in a different place. But in general, a lot of those areas are places that voted for Trump. And he's pulling us out again. This guy, Raul, and I'm blanking on his last name, he is one of the vice chairs of the IPCC. So that's that big report that they do every year, right? Thousands of scientists contribute to it. He spoke to the Lutheran World Federation youth delegation. It turns out that he's a friend of Elena, who's from the Lutheran World Federation, both from Latin America. And so he shared a number of different things. And one of the things that we asked was, where do you see hope, in the midst of all of this? And what he said was, it's really frustrating to see what's not happening at national levels and with all of these promises that were made with the Paris agreements. But what is happening is there is progress being made on mitigation and adaptation at subnational levels. And then he pointed at Christine and I and he said, you're from the United States, right? And I said, yep. And he said, at the state levels, at the city levels, at the county levels, that's where things are happening. And this year in Azerbaijan, my colleague Regina said that she actually had people who have been begging her to tell people, look, if you can't make progress with your members of Congress, talk to your county supervisor, or see what can be done at a more local level. And a lot of experimentation is happening at local levels, some of which has been really positive and exciting. We can take action, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level. The state level, we have seen some movement. Now this year doesn't look great for some things moving forward, but in 2023, a number of really important things moved forward. The challenge now is to make sure that those get implemented. And so in our coalitions and partner groups, there are people who are really looking at some of that and talking, some of them, about agency capture by industry. And so we're trying to strategize, like, okay, what does that mean? What do we need to do to change that? What kinds of conversations do we need to have? And I was in a meeting 2 months ago with folks from the MPCA, and actually we were talking about electronic waste, and folks looked at me and said, Tammy, can you share, because I said, if we can get church people writing about some of this and acting on it, then I think that we can also get church people to be bringing electronics to church and collecting them. And I was really pushing the MPCA because they're writing the legislation, or wrote the legislation, and I was really pushing to say, we need this now. We don't want to wait until January or February. We need this now if we're going to get people writing. Now, we still didn't get it until like last week. But they were hearing it, and they were paying attention. And so the person who was the main person on electronic waste, working with them, Maria, she said, that being able to have that meeting, that speaking up really helped. One of the things that I heard from a colleague from Germany is that peatlands are some of the best carbon capture and storage, or sequestration for carbon. And Minnesota, it turns out, has more peatland than any other place in the continental United States. Really? But a lot of it is not well cared for. A lot of it is in disrepair. A lot of it needs protecting. So that may be something else that we need to talk to our legislators about. I contacted someone at the DNR about, just what are we doing? And didn't get a very good response. They said, sort of vaguely, yeah, we're protecting it. But I didn't really get a sense that a lot was happening. So, but there are things like that that we can do. And then, to take it back to Maru.
We have to change the narrative. It's not just going to be about the economic losses, but rather the non-economic losses.
Yeah, we need to change the narrative. More than anything else, we need to be engaging people who've been backing up. We need to be engaging people who've been, who've turned into kind of, like, oh, there's nothing else we can do. There's always something that we can do. If we don't do it now, it's going to get worse. And then if we don't do something then, it gets even worse. It's not like, oh, well, it's either this or that. It's continually going to get worse unless we act and unless we get other people tuned in on it. And that's the biggest challenge in Minnesota right now. In a lot of congregations that I've been in, I've had people pick fights with me about climate change and whether it's real or whether it's a hoax and whatnot. So, yeah.
Well, I would say that one hope is consciousness, and I think it's growing. And I mean, an old man here, that's what I've noticed is that our ability to communicate, the fact that I can see the rest of the world here in my hand, and that has an impact, and of course the young people. And of course, then the catastrophes in North Carolina, and I mean, we're getting more conscious of it as a people, and I think we're becoming more and more aware how much we really are connected with one another, rather than being individuals.
That was the other thing I was going to mention in terms of hope is young people. High school, college, young adults, 20s and 30s. They are taking a lot of action. They are pushing for action. They're changing the minds of their parents. In cases I've seen it, where a parent has been, like, oh, well, this isn't that big a deal. And the kids have said, no, it's a really big deal. And then they bring their parents, like, umpteen bazillion different things. And the parents are like, huh. And they listen. And so I've seen people change their opinion because their kids have said, this needs to happen. Are there, yeah.
So would you say that, I don't know, letter writing, giving money, what's this, sort of action we should be taking? Of course, we should be looking at our own house and our own building, and but
a lot of it needs big action.
Yeah.
So like government action. So I'm actually really proud of the work that our Senate and House did on some of the legislation that got passed. Some of it had been in process for like 20 years. We've got one of those champions sitting right here. So I'm really proud of that, but we need to really, it's not just educating our lawmakers, because unless they are convinced that their constituents believe it's an issue, they're not going to move. And I was just thinking about this the other day as I heard Senator Gruenhagen interrupting something to talk about abortion. And I thought, if we could frame climate change in abortion terms, maybe he would listen. I think framing things is a big piece of it too. How are we going to put this in a way that people can hear it? And too often people are hearing it as a political issue, and so they're jumping to political extremes. I put together with someone from the Ministry Lab a program on graceful conversations with the idea that when we're in our churches, I need to recognize you as a beloved child of God, and you need to recognize me as a beloved child of God. And we need to be able to have conversations about difficult issues without, identifying someone as, oh, you're that, leftist liberal person, or you're that conservative, whatever. And I think that the polarization is really hurting us in this country. So that's a piece of it too.
I just
Yeah,
want to
Connie.
state that we're partners with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light at this church. And they are starting a leadership training on Tuesday for 8 weeks in a row on the adaptation part. What can the faith communities in this neighborhood do to address what's going to be happening in the future with climate refugees? And they want us to be involved, so I talked to Jim, our full-time neighborhood ministry person, and he's going to participate in this and bring it back to us as a congregation.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. And MNIPL is just a wonderful organization, a wonderful partner. They've done some really good work in terms of helping churches negotiate solar panels.
They helped us.
Did you get solar panels? I heard that you got a heat pump. I would love to learn more about your heat pump. Because that's a big thing that I think we need to do a lot more of, is move to heat pumps, and I've been looking at that in my house, but I need to expand my electrical capacity first. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.